So welcome everyone to our Wednesday webinette. Today we will be talking to you about communities of practice and care as a classroom approach. And I would like to start first of all by sharing that I'm joining all of you from the traditional lands of the Anishinaabe, the Haudenosaunee, the Lenape-Wauk, and the Attawandaron peoples in the city colonially known as London, Ontario. And so London is governed by the London Township Treaty of 1796. And while this land has become my home where I live, work, play, and raise my children, I was also born and raised on the island of Katagmuk, colonially known as Newfoundland. The image in the background of this slide that you see in front of you is of my favorite plant on the island, crowberry. And when I see, smell, and touch this plant, I know in real embodied ways that I am home. But of course, it's not that simple. As a cis, white, and queer settler on stolen land, I also know that crowberry is a dietary staple for Indigenous people in the global north, including the Inuit and the Sami peoples. As a settler, I am responsible for recognizing and contending with these tensions, or what Tuck and Yang call incommensurability, while also abiding by the TRC calls to action, the Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls Report, and the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. We're also fortunate at the University of Alberta to take guidance from Braiding Past, Present, and Future, the Indigenous Strategic Plan. I would encourage everyone who's here today to sit with that text and identify opportunities to reflect, learn, and take action in ways that meaningfully resist settler colonial structures, relationships, and practices in our institution and beyond. Jillian, if you'd like to offer your land acknowledgement.
Thank you, Mandy. And I am joining you all from the University of Alberta North Campus. It's located on the lands of Treaty 6 territory in the city colonially now known as Edmonton, Alberta. For thousands of years, this bend in the river has been a traditional gathering place for Indigenous peoples, including the Cree, Blackfoot, Métis, Nakota Sioux, Iroquois, Dene, Ojibwe, Saulteaux, Anishinaabe, Inuit, and others. I grew up on Treaty 6 lands, about an hour's drive from where I sit now, and it is the wide open sky that has always connected me to my home. I am the granddaughter of a German settler, and I too am responsible for grappling and with my settler colonial past and present, and committed to act in also meaningful ways to reconsider how I am in the world. And then I just quickly wanted to say that I took this picture not far from campus. That's the, colonially known North Saskatchewan River. And I like to just sometimes remember, or maybe we might say recover, an image of these lands before colonization happened. Even though we know there are houses behind those trees, this is maybe the view that the people who were originally here had.
And before we dive into our conversation on communities of practice and care, I also wanted to do a quick access check. And I've included a copy of our slides for today as a PDF in the chat if anyone would like to open those and possibly save them to your device, if that would be helpful for you. For transparency's sake, we understand access to be a shared responsibility between everyone in this space. And our goal today is to strive for an inclusive and accessible space that reduces the need for anyone to unwillingly disclose a disability or an impairment for the purposes of gaining an accommodation. Here, we want to be mindful about distinguishing between formal accommodations, which of course can be a difficult process to navigate, and access needs, which is something that we all bring to our spaces from a variety of social locations. In doing this work together, we strive to welcome disability and the changes it brings into our space. If you have an access need that we have not addressed, or if you notice a barrier that doesn't directly impact your own engagement, but may impact that of others, we invite you to feel free to bring it to our attention via whatever channel you prefer. And this access check is something that I have amended slightly, but that I discovered through the TA training program at the University of Toronto. So I've included a link to that resource. So today, myself and Jillian will be chatting with you a little bit about the community of practice and care model that we brought into CTL. Starting last summer, we have run 3 groups of the COPC so far, and Jillian was part of our fall cohort. And I wanted to frame this in terms of something that is probably familiar to most of you who are joining us today, and that is the concept of situated learning theory and of communities of practice. And situated learning theory is something that has been with us for a few decades, and it's built on the premise that context and relationships are important considerations in effective learning. Essentially, through communities of practice, experts and novices work together to co-discover and to co-create knowledge. And experts will support novices as they move from what these authors in this particular framework that you see in front of you call the periphery to the center as they become experts in their own right. And the article that's quoted here on situated learning theory, I'll just read a quick quote from that I think helps to kind of contextualize the diagram that's here. Learning does not occur exclusively by receiving decontextualized content and then applying it later. Instead, learning happens as a result of participating actively in a community of practice, which includes legitimate peripheral participation as its central defining characteristic. Learning occurs when it takes place in the context in which it is applied, so that we're not trying to create this really firm boundary, essentially, from the learning and then the application of that learning, that these things can coexist and work together. And under that model, care has always been kind of implied through the relationships built within this community of practice model, right? And so I wanted to reflect a little bit on why I opted to call this particular programming piece communities of practice and care. And I had a few reasons for doing that. The first is that it was really born out of my experience as an educator previously working in a writing center at the beginning of the pandemic. And one of the things that I think many of us experienced at the outset of the pandemic in 2020 was that there were suddenly these really renewed and urgent conversations about how we care for ourselves and how we care for each other at a moment when everything around us was unstable and stressful and even traumatic. And so what I think a lot of us saw was that conversations about accepting students as whole embodied people coming to our classrooms with all of these burdens facing them in this particular shared moment in history, sort of brought these conversations to the fore in a way that I haven't personally experienced in my own career. And as we started talking about how to enact and embody care in our classrooms, whether they were, as they were for so long, completely online, whether they were on site in physical classrooms or hybrid or blended models, we started to see that some of those conversations around care also aligned really nicely with really urgent conversations about indigenization and decolonization. And I'll get to that in a second, but I just want to say too that this was also dovetailing with a moment when many folks in the academy who carry a lot of power and privilege were also grappling with our responsibility to enact anti-racist pedagogies and praxis in the wake of the murder of George Floyd. And then at the same time, because we were dealing with this global pandemic, of course, that was putting strain on our healthcare and on our resources and sickening and disabling and killing a lot of folks around us. The conversations about, how we care for each other and how that plays into our teaching decisions and whether we're in person or online really spoke to some of my own interests as well in disability justice frameworks and how that sort of comes along with the language of care as well. And like situated learning theory, conversations about pedagogies of care, the way that care can be an important and rigorous component of our teaching practice, is not something new in the scholarship either. So I have a quote here at the bottom of this slide, and this is from an article that I drew a lot of inspiration from by Sarah Mata and Anna Bennett that came out in 2019. And they say that, as Antonia Darder describes, within these pedagogical traditions, The mind and its cognitive capacities have to be understood as only one medium for the construction of knowledge. With this in mind, students are seen as integral human beings whose minds, bodies, hearts, and spirits are all implicated in the process of teaching and learning. The affective or emotional and embodied elements of pedagogies of care become central to enabling the very conditions of possibility of careful epistemological work, embodying such work and nurturing other subjectivities. And it was through that article by Mata and Bennett that I started to think in terms, I think, really explicitly of how bringing this language of care and leaning and looking towards pedagogies of care could align with our responsibility to the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's call to action. My colleague, Andrea Menard, who's our lead educational developer of indigenizing curricula and pedagogies, has spoken to our community learning circle about the 7 grandfather teachings, which are a really a sort of common piece of wisdom that are held across a number of Indigenous nations and cultures. And these include values such as love, respect, bravery, truth, honesty, humility, and wisdom. And so in bringing care to the forefront, I think part of what I was hoping our groups would do together is to think about these kinds of values and how we bring them out in our teaching and in relationship, both with our students and with each other as well. So just to give you a quick overview of what these communities looked like in terms of how we organized them and set them up logistically, we kept these groups fairly small. We limited registration to about 12 participants max. We met virtually, given the situation with the ongoing pandemic, every 2 weeks, and these were semester-long communities of practice. As part of our building of our relationships and capacity to engage in really challenging and important conversations around EDI and indigenizing and decolonizing our practices, we developed guidelines for community engagement to ensure that we were all accountable for how we engaged in the group in a good way, and to be mindful of the fact that within our group, our own social locations would mean that some of us carried more power and privilege than others. We spent a lot of time reflecting on our social location and our positionality and how that impacted the way that we came to these conversations and to the work of indigenizing and decolonizing and engaging in equity forward teaching practices. As a facilitator, I co-facilitated with my colleague, Dr. Delbir Sembi, and we took a planned but flexible approach to our time together. And so what that meant was that we were paying attention to how these conversations were evolving in the moment. And while we were planning for future sessions, we were also really receptive to letting these conversations and plans move organically. So letting go, for instance, of plans if the conversation was veering in another direction that the participants were really interested in pursuing. We had opportunities for both written and spoken reflection, and those reflections were sometimes shared amongst all members of the group, and other times they were private. And we had a shared Google Drive for resource sharing as well. And all of the participants were made editors on that folder as well. Again, so we could really co-create and share resources amongst each other. So with all of that said, I've invited Dr. Jillian Lammermeyer to join us today. And Jillian is an assistant professor in the Faculty of Nursing here at the University of Alberta. And I have given her these questions in advance, but I wanted her to reflect a little bit with me and with all of you about her experience moving through a community of practice and care and what that might mean for her classroom practice as well. So I have 3 questions for Jillian today. And the first one for you is, why did you join the community of practice and care to begin with?
I mean, I joined because, I had become familiar with the Center for Teaching and Learning the year before. And I just found the help and support, invaluable, as I was a novice teacher. I'm not a novice nurse, but a new assistant professor and particularly new to teaching a large undergraduate course where I'm responsible for the whole thing, designing it, making the assessments. And so I attended the Online Teaching Institute and then heard about the community of practice and care. And, particularly that we would discuss things about like living out ideas of decolonization and equity and real compassion for the students. And I wanted to be a part of that, to really take on a pedagogical practice as ethical stewarding. I mean, I teach ethics and law, so I wanted to really also sort of walk my talk.
Yeah, I love that. Thank you. I think for me too, setting this program up in the first instance and going through that experience with all of you, I very much had the same kind of rationale for wanting to be there, right? To figure out ways to really live the values related to, EDI, to equity and anti-racism and indigenization. The next question is kind of twofold. I'd love it if you could reflect on what you experienced during the community of practice and care, and what perhaps you thought about as you moved through it as compared to the reason why you intended to join in the first place and how that aligned or didn't.
Yeah, so I joined not exactly knowing and sort of trusting that everything I'd done with the CTL had been good. And I sort of wanted, like, how can I be a better teacher? What kind of teacher do I want to be? And I think, when I joined, there was very immediately this realization that, the sessions were both about specific topics and conversations of care and decolonization, but that we were also living that model in the sessions. The different way that we introduced ourselves based on, I know a former CTL faculty, Jen Ward. I'm afraid I'm going to not pronounce the Cree words correctly, but Tante Ochi Kia.
Tante Ochi Kia, yeah.
Kia, thank you. So right off the bat, instead of introducing ourselves as, assistant professor, this is my research program, we were answering these questions, who are we connected to? So we were immediately, the tone was set to begin to know each other as members of a community together. And then, as we kept meeting, really these Friday morning moments became a reprieve from the rest of the week, in a sense, this kind of break from often unsaid but dominant ways of teaching in academia, of performing and producing and achieving. And I couldn't help but wonder, now we're going to talk a bit more about this. I certainly don't claim to have achieved this, but I couldn't help, it made me ask the question, what if I could somehow reproduce that? What if my class could be, in a sense, a reprieve for students? It's a lofty goal, but I'm sort of thinking that way.
I love that goal. And whenever we do, whether it's webinettes, programming at the Festival of Teaching and Learning at Online Teaching Institute, and we talk about some of the practices, what does it mean in practice to indigenize, to decolonize,
right,
take an anti-racist approach? There are very naturally, I think, a lot of questions that people have about logistics. Right? Like, what does that look like when I try to enact that in my space, given that we're all teaching in very different contexts with very different groups of students in different disciplines across the community. And so that kind of leads, I think, really well into the third question, which is about the implications that your experience with the community of practice and care might have for both your tangible, concrete practices in the classroom, but also your sense of self as an educator.
Yeah, which are both really things in development for me, in progress. And I feel like, too, a sort of important foundation for me is that, and I'm not claiming this is necessarily unique to nursing education, but it is a function of nursing education that we are teaching nursing students, for the students to learn, of course, and then also for all these future people and patients and residents that they will look after. And I feel that responsibility. So, you know, there were some practical things that happened because of these Friday morning meetings. You know, really, what kind of teacher do I want to be? What kind of role model can I be? More than just the words I say. You know, one of the things I transferred or learned, or, you know, in some ways I think almost was given permission to do, was to make myself visible to the students as a person. I mean, I think, you know, my personality leans that way, but both you and Delbia really embodied this balance between, you know, sharing knowledge. You were the people that facilitated, and we looked to you for sort of, is that right? Or, but at the same time, you know, not just acknowledging, but sort of embracing your own vulnerability. Like, well, yeah, I've had that happen, or sometimes I've asked this question. And so then we all sort of feel, again, you know, not just what we're talking about, but how we're talking about it. So the work isn't to necessarily know the answer, exactly how to decolonize, or because it's just not, the work isn't that way. So we are sitting in the mess of it all together, or the chaos, or the, you know, whatever, the not knowing. You know, a very practical thing is a more personal land acknowledgement to, you know, not read the land acknowledgements or consider them as something abstract or separate from me. You know, this sense of, you know, something that we have talked about, Mandy, is I think there's a similarity between teaching and nursing, where we talk a lot about boundaries and what's appropriate. And I've witnessed in my experience, I feel so much more conversation about crossing over boundaries, which of course we all want to be careful and mindful of that, but much less conversation about not getting close enough. And again, this was something that I feel like we embodied in these, we lived out, we tried to reach for, you know, how can we get actually close enough to each other to support each other? So I feel like, you know, there are practical things, and still outstanding things, you know, one of which is, you know, how do I make space for relationship building and the students, the people's unique, their own experiences and positions in such a large class? You know, if I think about that, maybe one obvious way is small groups, and then sort of acknowledging through this work that might involve me letting go of being the teacher for those moments of them being in small classes, small groups, you know, that I won't know everything they say, and even though I want to know what they're saying to develop relationship, but it just, the mechanics of a big class don't work that way. So sort of trusting them to figure these things out together. So there's been a lot of practical help, but a lot of, you know, also really reflective and philosophical help as well. Thank you.
I love, there are so many parts of that answer that I love. And one of them is the pieces around trusting the students, right? And seating space. I think a lot of us for a while now have been thinking about what it means to sort of move away from more traditional hierarchies, right, in the classroom, and invite students as partners into our teaching. The other piece that's really hitting me is that language that you used of like sitting in the mess together, right? Because I think it's in those really uncertain and uncomfortable moments where a lot of this work can and should happen, right? I often say to folks that if I'm not feeling uncomfortable when I'm talking about some of these really big considerations around ethics and indigenizing and anti-racism, then I'm probably not doing the work as much as I should be. So I love that. Thanks so much, everyone, for being here. The video of today's webinette will be placed online on our YouTube channel, usually within about 2 weeks. And if there's anything we can do at CTL to help you or to chat through in the meantime, please feel free to reach out. And finally, thank you to Jillian. This was really great. It was so much fun, and I'm so glad you could join us today.
Thank you. Thanks for inviting me, Mandy, and thanks everyone for your engagement. It was lovely to talk about this with all of you.